railroads in the U.S., and it occurred to me why there is not a transcontinental railroad company in the U.S. Okay, well, we'll talk about the Canadians. Now, Canadians, this is CN. I took this in Winnipeg in the 1970. That's one of their branch line units, very light, because they ran system box for years on their, they had branch lines with 70-pound rail. So, but this is the CN. Clearly, they go from Halifax, obviously Toronto and Montreal, all the way across to Vancouver and Prince Rupert. So they clearly were transcontinental. And they of course, in the United States, they had the Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific from Fort Francis down to Duluth, and then Grand Trunk Western from Sarnia down to Chicago, and the Grand Trunk went to Portland, Maine, and the Central Vermont went down to the coast in Connecticut. But they were transcontinental in Canada. Canadian Pacific, same thing, basically similar, except they were closer to the border. Because the Canadian government wanted them to build down here because there were a lot of Americans moving into British Columbia, and they didn't want British Columbia to become a state. So they made them build this line down here, and of course they had to build through the Kicking Horse Pass with the spiral tunnels and everything. Yeah, and this area, and Jim Hill wanted to build to Winnipeg and then have them all go west from Winnipeg, and he was actually correct physically, because I read it cost almost as much to go over Lake Superior as it costs to go across the Rockies, because this is that 2 billion-year-old granite up there, and it was, yeah, the Canadian Shield. But early on they saw the need, and the Soo line was kind of flubbing along with the Minneapolis and Atlantic and the Minneapolis Pacific. It was McMillan and some of the grain millers in Minneapolis got it started because they wanted to avoid Chicago, because they felt they were getting robbed in Chicago. So they wanted to be able to send grain to Montreal, which, if you look, isn't that far, and also have traffic west. So they took control of the Soo line in 1880, and they kept it, and so that gave them a Chicago connection when they took over the original Wisconsin Central. Okay, the exceptions, we'll just go over those very quickly. The Frisco, it was a big X from that had a hub at Springfield. They go from basically St. Louis down to Texas and Kansas City down to Birmingham and Pensacola. And in terms of our magic line, here's the Mississippi River here. And so this line that goes to Birmingham, and then the line down to Pensacola, and then, of course, the Alabama, Tennessee, and Northern, which they got them into Mobile. That's really an exception, but pretty much they're a west of the line railroad. And the GM&O, I took this in right by Lake Michigan in Indiana. This was pulling into a coal train, six units. And the Gulf Mobile in Ohio was the Gulf Mobile in Northern, which was here, and then the Mobile in Ohio came up like this, and got them into St. Louis. And if you've ever seen the movie This Property is Condemned with Robert Redford, and yeah, and that's sort of based, as I understand it, on one of the division points on the old Gulf Mobile in Northern. It was in Mississippi, and Robert Redford's coming out to give these guys pink slips. So that wasn't, and then of course Natalie Wood's running around. They had to make Hollywood out of it, but yeah, that was, she's a really good actress. But anyway, but it was that's how. Then they got a hold of the Alton and Southern, which went from Chicago to Alton and St. Louis over to Kansas City, and that got them into Chicago. So that was good. And I believe this route is now the Amtrak line, right? Isn't that correct? Yeah. But this is really the only exception. The GM&O is definitely an east of the line railroad. And of course, we have the Illinois Central. They were built, their charter was to build from Cairo to Rockford, Illinois Central. And then I was reading that yeah, I think you're right. I think it was Freeport. And then that line went up to Madison, Wisconsin eventually. But in the 1850s, Chicago was starting to come up, so they thought, well, we better build a branch line to Chicago. I thought that was interesting. Then, which of course became the main line. But I was also surprised that they started this in the 1860s, building across to Iowa, because they wanted to get traffic for the other lines. And so they were over to Council Bluffs, because of course that's where the UP is, Sioux City and Sioux Falls. And of course, Sioux City became huge because they became the meatpacking center of the United States for a time. But other than this exception here, and then this little line that goes across to Shreveport, they're pretty much an east of the line railroad. Wabash they're really the big exception. They're about 40% west of the line, or maybe 30% west of the line, and or third west of the line, third east of the line. Because they go basically Detroit to Kansas City and Chicago to St. Louis. Those are the two big lines. And they also bought the Ann Arbor, which gave them all the car ferries. They go from basically Toledo up to Alberta, Michigan, and then they go to Manistee and Menominee, Green Bay, and to Manitowoc. Oh, this is Kewaunee, and to Manitowoc. Yes, Omaha, Des Moines. So they had quite a bit west of the line. So they're but largely east, but they have a pretty good chunk here. This whole Western Division based in Moberly was pretty good. Okay, so then I was trying to find, okay, who tried to build an all the way across the Transcontinental Company, and the one that really came up was the Goulds, and there were Jay Gould got from his father-in-law. This Jay Gould was really good. He bought and sold railroads, and he got a hold of the Missouri Pacific and the Wabash, and he grew the Missouri Pacific quite a bit. But then he went after the B&O and the Central Railroad in New Jersey, and that was unsuccessful. So he didn't get his line. So he grew the Missouri Pacific to be quite a railroad. And here's the Wabash, and the yellow is the B&O that he was trying to get. So he was coming close. And then so son George inherited this from his father. He was also very successful, and so he bought the Western Maryland, and he bought the Rio Grande. And of course, when he saw I have the Rio Grande here, I've got to build myself a connection to the West Coast, because here he just had the Central Pacific, which is Southern Pacific, and that was not a friendly connection to him. So, and at this time, the Denver and Salt Lake kind of went up to Craig, but over the Rollins Pass, 11,500 feet, it was shut down 3 months a year. It was a mess. And so the main line of the Denver Rio Grande went from Denver to Pueblo, and then up over Tennessee Pass to Salt Lake City. And so that's why the Goulds built into Pueblo. So that's why the Missouri Pacific went to Pueblo. And if you were ever in Pueblo in the 60s, there was a huge yard there, joint yard with Denver Rio Grande, Mopac, Burlington, and Santa Fe. It was a huge yard. But the problem was building this thing, the Western Pacific was quite expensive. And of course, he went bankrupt. So that took care of that. Now, what happened later on? Well, Penn Central and Conrail. Penn Central was, of course, how not to do a merger. And then I was impressed, though, how Conrail, they fixed everything. They actually did a good job. And then, of course, Illinois Central and GM&O, BN and BNSF, UP, and the Union Pacific took over Mopac, MKT, Southern Pacific, the Northwestern, and the Western Pacific, if you can imagine. And then, of course, Chessie merged with the Seaboard Coastline, and Norfolk Southern merged with the Southern. And then, of course, CN took over IC. And then the recent thing, which really prompted this, was the CP and the KCS. Now, I found this on the internet. These are all the railroads that disappeared through those mergers in the last 60 years. And you see them all like that, and you go, wow, that's a lot of railroads we knew as when we were kids. Yeah, yeah, that's right. And then, of course, we have some ill-fated ones. If you remember this one, this was Santa Fe and Southern Pacific decided they were going to merge in 1983. And I remember this is in Barstow in 1990. They still had red units all over the place. They went crazy. Yeah, that's what yeah, these are the Kodachromes. Yeah, that's what Trains Magazine called their article, "Shouldn't paint so fast," you know, and because they painted a lot of engines and a lot of equipment stuff. But you see why the government turned it down, because here's California, and you look at the SP line. They have the central line going down the Central Valley, and they have the coast line, and then of course the line going over to Salt Lake City, and then the Santa Fe goes from Sacramento basically down the valley to Barstow and east, and to Los Angeles and San Diego. And all of a sudden you have that as one railroad. That is a one railroad state.
Monopoly all through New Mexico and Arizona.
Yes. And so, because basically at that time, all you had was the Los Angeles and Salt Lake, which is the UP came in here at Yermo, California, and then trackage rights down to LA. And then of course you had the let's see what at that time there was UP coming in here, but that was it. And so the whole state would have been one railroad. So it was turned down. However, when the BN and the Santa Fe decided to merge, that got approved, and you can see why. Here's the green is the Burlington Northern, and with the exception of this area down in here with the Frisco, that's really the only areas where any competition would have been reduced. But of course, you have the UP in that area anyway. So this blue is the Santa Fe, and the green is the Burlington. Was the Burlington, and so they considered it an end-to-end merger. Now the Milwaukee 2 sale, that's an interesting thing. Of course, as we talked about, basically Milwaukee was pretty much pared down because of their bankruptcy. This kind of a crude graphic, but it shows it. The purple lines are all the lines that they basically tore up, and there's some thin or sold. Yeah, some of them sold. And so this is what the Milwaukee 2 was, basically St. Paul to Milwaukee to Chicago. And then the line that, if you remember, they had this sort of a secondary line that went down the river from La Crescent to Dubuque, and then down to Savannah, and then on the Davenport, Rock Island, and Northwestern through Davenport, and then down here to Kansas City. And that sort of was a nice secondary line. I'm not even sure when they had the last passenger train. That would have been what, 50s? Yeah,
late 50s.
Late 50s. But of course now with the CPKC, that became extremely important. Yeah, you never.
The cornfield line through, or that river road, that river line that was so, so weak,
Yeah,
would become part of that.
It's the main line of the CPKC. So as I understand it, and Barney Olson wrote a good article in Trains some months ago, the Canadian National Grand Trunk wanted this because CN at this time was, for their Chicago connection, was coming in on the Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific, and then they ran on the old Great Northern line, and then the Q. And so they were paying trackage rights to BN. If you remember in the 90s, you saw a lot of CN trains, but they were interested in buying the Milwaukee, but the problem was they already had a Chicago connection, so they couldn't afford that much money because they're already, what's the difference between trackage rights here and owning the railroad? It gives them some advantage, but not that much.
Yeah, trackage rights on the NP to Duluth.
Yes, that's right.
That was the critical part.
Yes, that was the critical part.
It was called the sprint trains, and then the courts turned against that, and that's a sad thing here.
Yeah, I remember reading this was those guys they have a 999-year lease that they got. The NP gave the Milwaukee a 999-year lease. I mean, these guys are thinking big and because the Milwaukee was going to build to to Duluth. And so the NP said, well, we'll give you trackage rights. You know, they had to pay trackage, trackage.
Trackage right.
Yeah. But it was 990 years and it's transferable. So the BNSF now has it, you know.
I think it happened Portland to Seattle.
Yes,
The UP was saying, hey, we'll build a route up there, and the NP at that time couldn't tolerate that.
that's right.
So the UP ran over the Milwaukee or the Northern Pacific.
And they still do.
Yep.
So the Grand Trunk was kind of in there as a stalking horse. And so Chicago Northwestern comes in. And again, here we're looking at, this is Wisconsin right here, if you can kind of see it, all the lines that the Northwestern had in Wisconsin. And so they offered 850 million for the Milwaukee 2. And the Sioux line comes in and they didn't want the CN to get it. So they bid 750 million. And basically what Barney said in the article is they didn't have the money. And so they just bid this. And so then the judge says, hey, and so the Northwestern was out like the SP was doing. They were painting depots and painting equipment and all this stuff. And the Judge McMillan says, in the first place, you're not going to preempt me. I'm not done yet. And the second place, look at Wisconsin. This is the Milwaukee lines. Now some of these are gone, but here's the Northwestern lines. Who else is there? Yeah, I mean the Green Bay and Western and maybe a couple little railroads. I mean that's it. So the judge turned it down, and so the Sioux line ended up with the Milwaukee, which runs down the river, and then of course to Chicago, and then of course the line to Kansas City. And then Illinois Central took over. Now this is interesting because one of the few side-by-side mergers that I could find that was approved. And I think it was, if I remember, that the Gulf Mobile in Ohio was a very weak railroad financially. And they didn't want another bankruptcy and a shutdown, Chapter 7, like the Rock Island was. So they approved that. And then of course the CN came in and merged with the IC. The CN, of course, goes from Halifax to Vancouver, but now with the IC, and they have Chicago to New Orleans. Now, interestingly, this line here, this was, see if I can get back there. Yeah, this was the original Wisconsin Central and Sioux line. And they created the Lake State Division. I mean, it wasn't strategic at all. I think it was very tactical. Yeah. Oh, the Lake States was non-union. I see. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, it ended up biting them because guess who ends up with it? It becomes the Wisconsin Central 2. And then of course the CN has it. So they basically sold a really nice line to their competitor. Not strategic. And of course the UP, this is after they took over the Northwestern and the MKT and the Missouri Pacific. And then of course the SP, and then of course now the big one in the news is the CP KC, which of course is Vancouver to and they apparently have recently bought the track back that goes to New Brunswick, so they are touching the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, and then through the Sioux line and the Milwaukee and this obscure Milwaukee line we're talking about, they connect with the Kansas City Southern, and then Kansas City Southern has trackage all the way down to I think it's Tampico, Mexico. And then of course something even more important is the Kansas City Southern had the Panama Railroad, which has become huge because of climate change and also because of the huge ships. They're limiting how many ships can go through the canal.
Drying up.
It is, and so companies are saying, well, okay, so we'll bring in a ship from Hong Kong, we'll put it on rail cars, send it over here, and then we can subdivide this and sort it. And so this ship will go to the East Coast US, this one will go to Lisbon, this one will go to the UK. And so they're using it as a sorting terminal. So we've ended up with 6 railroads. We have the 2 Canadian railroads, Canadian Pacific, CN in Canada and in the central United States, the CSX and the Norfolk Southern in the east, and the BNSF and UP in the west. And the Surface Transportation Board has said, that's fine. and there aren't going to be any more mergers. So any questions? Yes.
Wasn't Al Perlman of the New York Central interested in merging with the Santa Fe? I thought there was some talk about a Santa Fe New York Central merger.
That makes sense. He was a really an advanced guy. So yeah, I
Remember, Dave Herbert claimed that there was talk of a New York Central C&O merger years ago.
Yep. Yeah, that was the CNO and the New York Central, would have been a great combination. Whereas the B&O and the CNO was more like almost a parallel thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the CNO and the New York Central would have been a lot better than the Penn Central.
That was Central Mac.
Yeah. So, yes.
Is there any way they could have saved the Milwaukee Road?
But the problem was, where's the Milwaukee here?
You know, hypothetically, could you have forced the commission to force the NP to take the Milwaukee and let the Great Northern take the Burlington? But I'm sure that was never considered very well.
The problem was that they did pretty well until the 60s. And then, of course, when the merger came in, they lost so much traffic because, of course, the BN, they didn't get traffic anymore. They did get this connection to Portland, and they were all of a sudden getting a lot of traffic in the early 70s from yeah, and they're all of a sudden they were seeing these huge trains. But unfortunately, they'd had 20 years of deferred maintenance, and they started putting them on the ground.
Yeah.
You know,
I worked for the Milwaukee
Oh,
back
did you?
around 66, 67. And I could see it going to hell then.
Yeah.
They were getting 2 trains a day at Portland off the Southern Pacific.
Yeah, big trains. Yeah.
Right.
But unfortunately, the plant wasn't there.
Our switch jobs, we had the duty to bring the time freights, 263, 4, 261, 262, 3 and 4 from Fifth Avenue south of Minneapolis to the St. Paul yard. So that was our little claim to fame there.
Well, some of those were big trains. Well, fast. I remember trying to chase 261 at night. Oh my gosh. Woo.
But they still had the good track.
Yeah.
The Olympian was taken off the Olympian Hiawatha was taken off in 61. That's where the track started to decline because they didn't need that 80-mile-an-hour track anymore.
Yeah.
West of Aberdeen finally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Oops, sorry. That's Union Pacific, because in 1955, Ben Heineman took over the Northwestern, and he didn't want passenger trains, so the Milwaukee took over the passenger train, the city's trains from the Union Pacific. Prior to that, they were on the Northwestern.
5 was the big move.
Yeah. But this just goes to Chicago. So yeah, but there's not one company. That was the point. There's not one company that goes coast to coast. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great program, man. Great program.